given your wide background in terms of civil society and the fact that you witnessed firsthand the challenges to the rule of law, for example, in the G8, G20 meetings, what do you see is the systemic barriers to the modern notion of the rule of law in Canada?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Ça me fait toujours grand plaisir, évidemment, de discuter avec vous des grands enjeux de notre société. So if I think 800 years ago, Magna Carta, I think we have 800 years more to go to really fully realize the promise of the rule of law. And let me say to start that I view the rule of law not just as process-driven, but certainly as an ethos of empowerment of democratic processes as good governance. So it's not only about following the rules, but it's actually embracing the rules, celebrating the way in which constraints on power make us better, make us a better society and a more just one. So if you read Lord Tom Bingham, you say the rule of law is no one's above the law, all are equal in front of the law, there must be access to law, and law, it's about law, not about arbitrariness. And in my view, on all four counts, we still have lots of work to do. And some of the systemic problems, and I would part company maybe with respect with Judge Paciocco when he said, oh, I think I have a more important role now than I had as an academic. But in a way, I would say, and it's probably because I returned to academia, I think documenting the gap between what the law promises and what the law delivers is essential to pursuing the rule of law. If you're going to blind yourself and just say, oh, well, everything's good and we're just following the rules, I think there is a role in all of civil society to fully embrace that there's a responsibility to denounce when there's a gap and to do something about it. So systemic problems with achieving the rule of law. Number one, lack of accountability. I think we have to move beyond the next phase of the rule of law. It's not simply to say, oh, we're checking all the boxes, we passed all of the processes necessary, but we have instituted and we have created institutions that make it happen, that allow us to, that internalize the rule of law, that ensures that there's accountability for police officers, for security officers, for CBSA, for the Canadian Border Service. We don't have it. And the way in which we have elections law, electoral laws that have sufficient strength and sufficient accountability, so they cannot be ignored. So in a way, we have to move from the rules to the institutions that make it happen. We cannot tolerate the gap. Second point is, if we're going to say no one's above the law, and the second, all are equal in front of the law, well, I think it's pretty hard to say that in a more and more unequal society. So the problem of the rule of law in an unequal society becomes much more important. And there must be access to law. Well, if there's a problem of access to justice, by definition, we are in questioning whether indeed we're fully in a rule of law system. And finally, let me just end on the way in which a rule of law was also about even the good processes, ensuring that there's good democratic processes. So my view would be big omnibus bill are not representative of the rule of law either. And so I think the way in which we may have gone to a system where we're no longer embracing the promise of the rule of law. We're simply ticking the boxes and being satisfied that, by and large, we're better than others. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathalie. Again, I'm going to, based on what you've just said, ask you to think about some issues which we can come back in the second round. And it goes back to actually the political and power makeup of the original Magna Carta. As I said, the Magna Carta was born essentially not because King John wanted there to be a foundational principle of the rule of law. Absolutely not. He was being threatened with his throne being overthrown by the barons. And this guy was ruthless. He was basically stealing the barons' wives, children, and basically considering himself above the law. And it's only when the barons decided to take him on and get together. And finally, they actually even took over London at one point to say to him, your time is almost up. He relented and came up with the Magna Carta. Given that history, Nathalie, given what you just said, that a lot of the problems of the rule of law lies with this inequality of power and inequality of resources in our society, how on earth can civil society be able to bridge that gap? Maybe you have an answer. Many people don't, myself included, but maybe you will have an answer to that. So think about that as we go to the second round. Nathalie, do you want to go to the question I asked you?
Yeah, so your question was about how do you do the rule of law in an unequal world? And in my view, it's the rule of law in that context demands of the powerful that they empower the powerless, and they tell the indifferent that it matters. So I think the powerful, and I'm talking more broadly about all power, all exercise of power, not just the exercise by government or by the state in its multiple forms, but even, dean's office as well, you should value the constraints that are put upon the exercise of power. So if there's you should value them in a way that empowers the powerless, that you want to give, empower them to question your decisions and because that's what the more constraints, the more, and you have to believe that that's what gives you more legitimacy. And I think that's the message of the rule of law is always, power corrupts, big power corrupts more, and therefore you should protect the exercise of power by imposing on it lots of restraints. So you welcome restraints, you cherish oversight. You want it badly. And then you obviously want this to be shared and empower and ensures that the powerless in our society have access to the mechanism to be heard, not to be, and to be heard meaningfully in a way that they can be influential in the process. And you also have to convince everyone, the indifferent, the ones that are not particularly in that dilemma of powerlessness in certain circumstances, that indeed it does matter. It does matter. They have a responsibility not to abandon and to continue to want power to be exercised in a controlled fashion with welcoming restraints. And even if that costs a little, maybe that costs delay, that costs some sort of wrangling, rule of law may not be always synonymous with efficiency. Having said that, I think I would just finish on this, is that time is an interesting factor here. At the CCLA, we used to worry a lot that, accountability too late is just as bad as no accountability. So there has to be a mechanism of accountability that is in real time, that makes the possibility of experiencing that indeed we are moving toward a rule of law mechanism, not just in a dream and then future life, but actually in a way that it can materialize really, so people don't give up and don't internalize the despair and the abandonment. So.
Just a very quick supplementary. As I said, that Magna Carta was actually a result of civil disobedience by the barons. What's your view on civil disobedience?
Well, civil disobedience is a political gesture, and in a way, law is there to discipline politics. Yeah, that's what. If you choose to be if you decide to make your fight one that is of civil disobedience, then you have chosen to enter the political realm and to tell the powerful that they have lost the moral authority. So now, my own view is I don't think there is a principle of proportionality that ought to be observed all the time. There's no, the powerful, the government could decide, and certainly I think in the context of sentencing, in the context of recognizing the importance of expressing dissent, of continuing to express dissent, of making it count, you cannot treat dissenters worse than other people. And that sometimes happens where there are people that have choose civil disobedience or held out as being anarchist and outside of the boundaries of things. So I think we have to be careful. And I do think that rule of law does demand the exercise of proportionality in both sentencing and the exercise of power.
Thanks, Nathalie.